really like your setup and your little tableau right there, much better than what I have. It's just, but it's perfect because it's warm. It's got that, it's got the holiday feel. But I've been waiting for this anxiously, even though I just reached out about a week ago, because at this time of year, it's James Stewart is so much on my mind, and it's not necessarily about the movies. And I guess the words, the word iconic is ascribed at ad nauseum these days, and it's just too much. But I do think of certain images, and the one thing that always gets me, it doesn't have to be at Christmas time, it's all year round, and that's the one of George Bailey praying at the bar. And in recent years, I think ever since I read the Mighty Eighth by Gerald Astor, I've been mindful of what he had gone through. But you're a biographer, and you've written this book that I have not begun to read yet, but I've been fascinated and with the interviews that I've seen. And I guess if you, as a writer, in your most elevated language, could describe Jimmy Stewart circa 1946 during the production of It's a Wonderful Life, uniquely a movie star before and after, but not singular as a 30-something-year-old guy who's just come back from something indescribable. Who was he?
He was, what was he? 38 years old, going on 58, I would say, based on what he had just gone through. A man on the edge, a man questioning his value, his worth. 1 foot out the door of Hollywood, ready to go back to Pennsylvania and run the hardware store, because he wasn't getting roles. He wasn't getting offers coming back. The war hero, everybody assumed, no, he'll get a lot of parts, but everybody could see the toll, the physical toll and emotional toll the war had taken on him. And he looked so much older, and his hair was thinning and gray. And so that was the character, that was the actor that played George Bailey. It was the only part he was offered. And he didn't want to take it, because when he got off the ship, he came back on the Queen Elizabeth. And when he got off the ship in New York, he was asked, well, what do you want to do? What do you want to play now that you're back? And he said, I want to do a comedy. If anybody will have me, I want to do a comedy. And he wasn't offered a comedy. He was offered this crazy story about a man committing suicide, and that's the last thing he wanted. I mean, he had seen suicide at his base in England. And an angel intervenes, and this made no sense to a kid from Pennsylvania. A very down-to-earth guy from Pennsylvania had no interest in this story, but it was all he was offered. So to answer your question in a very roundabout way, that's who Jim Stewart was in 1946 when he began production of It's a Wonderful Life.
What had he been through, just in a nutshell, before I want to get a little granular on you, but if you were to just kind of encapsulate, how many years had he been away from the studio lots and in uniform?
4+ years away. But okay, so he was drafted late in 1940, and he was deferred because he was terribly underweight. He was 6'3" and 149 pounds. That doesn't add up. It doesn't meet the vertical and the horizontal on the chart. So he was deferred. Once he got in, he had to fight to get in the service, and then he had to fight to not be assigned to the motion picture unit. So he spent 2 years. First he got his wings, and then he became an instructor because he was older, he was mature. So he was made a flying instructor. Then he was made an instructor of 4-engine bombers, and he's biding his time stateside doing all this, base after base. When he finally gets called up called to active duty, it's only because the first wave of the 8th Air Force had basically been obliterated over places like Schweinfurt. And so they needed a second wave, and he was suddenly expendable because he could help morale so much. So he goes over and he flies 20 combat missions, including like 12 in the first 3 months he was over there. And on the 12th mission, I think it was the 12th mission, his plane was hit by flak on the flight deck. A shell came up through the flight deck and exploded and blew a hole between his feet in the fuselage. And his map case went down into Germany. And he cracked up just like the plane cracked up. When it landed, it went like that, right behind the flight deck. And that was too much. I mean, it was just too much. It was 12 missions. He was in some aspect of command on every one of his first 12 missions, either, commanding his part of the formation or the entire formation, or more than one bomb group's formation. He's always in the right seat as a co-pilot leading a mission in some aspect. So after 12 of those, seeing so many of his guys go down, the stress of command, having to make, audibles in the air, for lack of a better term, he cracked up. Then he flew 8 more missions, but spread out because he just couldn't take it. He couldn't take it. He couldn't take being up there very much. So those 20 missions aged him tremendously. There's a before and after. Hopefully you can cut away to it. A side-by-side comparison of Jim when he got his wings at the beginning of 1942, and then Jim in mid-1944. And he looks like his own father. He's aged so much just from his service.
What do you think informed that kind of determination to really leave a fairy tale lifestyle? Now, some people of my generation might be able to grasp it, but only because we remember our grandparents and those who were part of this sadly nearly gone greatest generation. What was his family life like that nurtured this intense yearning to serve in an armed capacity?
The book is called Mission, not because of combat missions, but because of Jim's personal mission to serve that was instilled in him, beat into him by his father and his grandfather. He had both of his grandfathers. His mother's father was a general in the Union Army, one of the heroes of Gettysburg. Really? While Chamberlain was at the top of Little Round Top charging down, his grandfather was at the bottom of Little Round Top charging across the Valley of Death and securing part of the Union line on the second day's battle. That was his. What was his mother's father? I knew you were going to ask me that.
Don't worry. I'll find. Look it up.
I forget, but it's in the book. I'll remember it. His father's father was also called James Maitland Stewart. He was a sergeant in the Signal Corps and served in the Shenandoah Valley. So he was there under Phil Sheridan and served near Custer, saw Custer quite a bit, and was in the Battle of Cedar Creek and the Battle of New Market and several battles that were really intense. And the elder James Maitland Stewart, Sergeant Stewart, lived into the 1930s. So he helped to raise Jim and told him about what the Civil War was like, not storybook Civil War, but the real blood and guts Civil War. So, and so service to your country was extremely important to all the Stewarts. Then Jim's father went off and served in the Great War and was a captain of ordnance near the front lines in the Great War. Then it was going to be Jim's turn, and that's why he became a pilot. In the 1930s, he bought himself an Army trainer, and he started to get ready because he knew it was going to be his turn. He could see what was happening in Europe. He went over to Europe like in 1939, just to get the lay of the land because he knew he would be over there.
Was there any specific? He naturally would have fought in any theater, but was there something that politically motivating him, as well as the sort of the mythology that existed that gave young men this urge to take part in, their generation's, most pivotal narrative? Was there something about Germany fighting them, or would he have just gone anywhere?
No, I think he would have gone anywhere. I've never been asked that question, but the immediate need of the 8th Air Force, which he was in, he was channeled into the 8th Air Force, and the immediate need was over the continent. That was where they needed pilots, and that's where he finally got his shot, was in a new bomb group that was going over to East Anglia in England to set up shop.
What drew you to this subject? Because you can't get into something like this without really feeling it, to telling the story correctly, but there's a lot of minutia in terms of records and things like that. How did it affect you?
Well, I'm a Hollywood guy and a researcher, and I had done this book on Carole Lombard, the actress, and the plane crash that killed her, and all the aspects of that crash and her life, and the rescue efforts to save the people on the mountain after the plane crashed. And all that was, heavy aeronautics, heavy aviation. And that book did well. And I was looking for another topic, and a friend of mine, one of my best friends, suggested I do Stewart's military service. And I said, you can't do that. I can't do that, because he would never talk about it. He never talked about it. It was written into his picture contracts. Don't ask me about the war. He never talked about his combat. And I thought, if I don't have his quotes, if he doesn't tell the story in any aspect, how am I going to do this?
Wow.
But then I found this researcher in DC who spends all of her time, to this day, as far as I know, digging through military records. And she quickly and efficiently found me the combat action reports of Jim Stewart's bomb group. And all of a sudden I had everything. All I needed to know was the date of the missions he flew. And then she would pull the records, and I would have everything. What I would have, the time they took off, the cloud deck, the wind speed, the bomb loads, the crews, the names of the ships, and where they were going, and where they were picking up flak, where they were picking up fighters, what the target was, what the approach was. I had everything. It was unbelievable.
Wow.
Then I had the after action reports, where they sat down and debriefed and talked about what they experienced. And so I could recreate, plus I got very lucky to find some guys that flew with Stewart that were still alive, including officers. And so they helped me tell the story. I mean, you want to talk granular, you're in the air, you're up there for those missions, especially the rough ones. There were some that were kind of milk runs, and there's not a whole lot to tell, but there were some really rough ones, and you'd swear you were up there, because I felt like I had to write a book that would be beyond reproach, because how the buffs are about everything. You have to get it right, or they'll nail you. And so my peer review was really hardened aviators, and so I really feel like I have a watertight, airtight product in this book, and it really has gotten great reviews, and nobody has ever, let me knock on wood, nobody's ever dinged me for the research.
What was the most exciting part of the research, or was there something that hooked you? Obviously, you love the man's, acting, and his films are they speak for themselves. What was it about? What was it about this, though? What got the hook in you once you started doing it? Because there's that moment.
Yeah, well, there's a go, no go point. And the go, no go point for me is the research there. And digging into these reports are fascinating. They each mission would have 100, 200 pages about it, and you would get everything. But the big moment for me was going to his base, Tibenham, England, which is in the middle of nowhere, northeast of London, way northeast of London, near southwest of Norwich, way over near the coast, was his base. And riding around on the runways and seeing a few of the Nissen huts still there, serving other functions. And then the moment that our guide, who was the historian for the 445th, took us onto a farm, back into a farm field to Jim Stewart's barracks, where he spent his time. He was barracked with another officer, and the two of them, he would talk about life on the ground. So he would talk about what it was like in the barracks, waiting for a mission or killing time. And he said he never got warm the whole time he was there. So here I am in this barracks, which is now a chicken coop. And I'm looking up and I see, the hole in the ceiling where the Franklin stove used to be. So I know this is the spot where he was huddling to keep warm. No matter what clothes he put on, he just could not get warm the whole time he was there. And here I am in this concrete barrack that he lived in for 4 months. It wasn't that long, but it was intense. And that was the coolest moment for me, riding around those runways and walking through the mud of Tibenham, England, just like he did.
How did you dress? Did you dress for the occasion?
Yeah, I mean, well, see, unfortunately, I told my wife, "Hey, guess what? We're going to go to Europe," and we went to not only England, but we went to Frankfurt because he bombed Frankfurt, and that was going to be a key moment in the book.
Yeah.
So we didn't go and see, Eiffel Tower and Big Ben. We went to Tibenham and it slogged through the mud. But
you owe her another trip.
Well, we have made other trips since then, but they've also been research trips. So, but they've been better than this one. It was better than the mud.
I would imagine. What were there any Eureka moments? Because I'm thinking you have flight rosters, you have crew names, you interview some people, but were there letters available that described his thoughts, anything home that you had access to or anything like that?
There was one, okay, so the mission I talked about where the piece of shell, 88 shell, goes up into the fuselage.
Yes.
That was the mission to Gotha, Germany, that was after the roughest day the 445th had, where they went to Gotha to bomb this factory, and they got chewed to pieces. And like 8 out of 14 ships got shot down that went up that day from his bomb group, and they come limping back. And then he sits in on the debriefs of all of these crews that say, "Oh man, the 190s jumped us. They're shooting these incendiary rockets. The ships are burning." He actually heard about guys bailing out without their parachutes, smacking into the windscreens of the ships, being cut up in the propeller. I mean, like, it was hell on earth. And he was leading the mission back there the next day because they had not destroyed the target. They have to go back to Gotha the next day. And he describes in just, heartbreaking detail how he's standing at the window in his quarters, and it's late at night, and there's fog out the window, and he's thinking about how he has to lead this mission the next day. He's in command, and they're going to go back and do exactly the same thing that they had done today. And that was something, to put that all together, to understand through the research what had happened that day. And one of my aviator guys was shot down that day, and that's his Clem Leone. He's a major character in the book. He shot down before they get even into Germany. He shot down over Holland, and then his story is one of being picked up by the Dutch resistance, and he makes his way down. Then he's betrayed in Antwerp and spends the war in a prison camp. So that's the mission that he leads, where he cracks up, where the stress just gets to him. But I have that reminiscence where he talks about, like, sitting there, am I up to it? Am I good enough? And that was the most intensely personal moment in the book.
I mean, he also had training accidents stateside where death was upon him. I can imagine recovering from that, let alone going off to war after. It's just the nerves of the survivors, the surviving veterans that I spoke to are still. I remember you mentioned 88s. My late uncle had been in the Battle of the Bulge, and his he was part of an artillery battery, which, like the 88s, they took the anti-aircraft guns and they pointed them straight at. And I remember asking him, I asked him, I said, Uncle Marty, Uncle Marty, what do you remember about the 88s? And he just looked, he paused, didn't even look at me. He said, fucking Germans. It was just, it wasn't for show. I had a little tape recorder. He was in a veterans assisted living, and it was just something that's always stayed with me. And he was on the ground. I always think of my favorite movie of all time is Best Years of Our Lives, which at the end, I think it's Dana Andrews. Is that who played? He's a former
bombardier. Yeah.
Bombardier, and you could tell that even in post-war, I was on the ground in a tank while you flyboys were up there, and he got very. They tell somebody like myself who doesn't know, other than the basic Memphis Belle type stuff, how cold it got up there, how, like, other than the hot death flying upward towards the ground and eviscerating your entire flight column. What were some of the conditions that few people have no idea that might have impacted you while you were researching that you didn't know?
Well, I had to go up in B-17s and B-24s. You have to, because how can you write about it if you don't know? Like, and the first thing you notice when you taxi is it's like you're in the back of a box truck times 10. I mean, it's loud, and it's so loud. You've got these 4 engines, they're right next to you, 2 on this side and 2 on this side. So you've got the noise, the relentless noise, and it rattles. You rattle this way, you just pitch and yaw the whole time you're in the air. And then for them, like, okay, I'm flying at 2,500 feet, on a summer's day, and it's 65, 70 degrees up there. But for them at altitude, Jim's first mission was on December 16th, 1943. That's German winter. And he's flying to Kiel, Germany, which is right at the top of Germany at the intersection with Denmark. And so from that mission on through Gotha in February, every mission was flown at minus 40 degrees, minus 45 degrees Fahrenheit at altitude at 20,000 feet. Their oxygen, their lines would freeze, their condensation would freeze into these massive icicles, and they'd be beating the icicles off themselves. Anytime you took your glove off for any reason, you would get frostbite in like 45 seconds. And a lot of cases of frostbite kept guys out of the air because they couldn't, they could lose fingers, they could lose toes. So that was the big thing, was then oxygen deprivation. If something happens to your fuel lines, they had heated flying suits that were this completed circuit that would flow through their bodies, and the wires were notorious for breaking, so their flight suits would not heat anymore. All the layers of clothes they had to wear, they're wearing, gloves with mittens on top of the gloves. So then operating controls, guns froze, guns jammed, you name it. There was nothing glamorous about it being a flyboy at 20,000 feet. You would wish you were in a tank on the ground, And then, after everything I've described, I haven't even talked about flak and fighters yet,
Let's hear it. Just I want everyone to buy the book, But in terms of how would you describe? Because you see the blackened sky with puffs of black smoke, and at first it looks kind of interesting, and then you realize, wow, they're trying to shoot those planes down in the sky, and they're successful a lot of the time.
Yeah, they are successful, and they're more successful. Like if you watch the old TV series 12 O'Clock High, where I was a little kid watching reruns of 12 O'Clock High, not understanding, well, what are all those puffs of smoke? But the flyers I talked to will tell you that those puffs of smoke were really deadly, and they would really mess with the ship. And it was like these little metal shards would hit the ship, and they would punch through the fuselage, and all of a sudden you'd be like looking at this constellation of little holes, and God help you if it hit an engine. That's what they were going after, was the engines. You could knock out one engine of a B-24, and that's all Jim flew, was B-24 Liberators over there. He had trained on B-17s, but they needed B-24 pilots, so that's why he went in with Liberators.
How many to a crew on a Liberator?
Pardon?
How many to a crew on a Liberator?
10. So yeah, flak was extremely dangerous, and fighters, when there was really this tipping point in the war by February, well, it's, when the Mustangs got their drop tanks, when the Mustangs came online, the P-51s, to escort the bomber groups, and they got their drop tanks to extend their range so that they could go all the way to a target in Germany and all the way back. They would trade off, and there would be, fighter protection. That's when the war changed. But when Jim started flying in December and January, they did not have continuous protection all the way to it and from it. So
they didn't have the continents. Maybe part of Italy,
Yeah, right.
In North Africa.
Yeah. So they would lose their fighter escort by the time they got to like the Zuiderzee and were crossing Holland into Germany. And they would have to go through that whole stretch. And that's why he was an exceptional flyer, because he kept very tight formations, very tight. And, he kept formation integrity so that there was maximum gun protection all the way around. He believed in it. He went by the book. He was a very strict by the book flyer. And so he lost fewer guys and fewer ships because of it. But there was still this tremendous vulnerability when you didn't have fighter protection. And that was another thing that caused Jim just so much stress was, he knew he was going to be responsible for X number of guys, 200, 400 guys in ships behind him through these runs when there was no fighter protection. In addition to it being minus 40 and all of the problems of being in the air. Plus the B-24 was notorious for having these fuel leaks. When you got in a B-24, you could smell gas a lot of the time, and they would just sort of blow up sometimes. And I've got documented stories of blowing up. And then there's the whole problem of you have all of these bomb groups really packed into this tight area of East Anglia. And all of the bomb groups were together, and all the fighter groups were in a different part of England. So when bombers took off from one bomb group at one base, like 5 miles away over here is the next base, and they're taking off, and they are flying into a cloud deck. And if they turn 1 or 2 seconds too early or too late, boom, they collide.
Unbelievable.
Tremendous explosion, 20 guys dead instantly. So there's the pressure of that. So, you name it and they faced it.
Oh my goodness. Was Joe Kennedy, was he in the same area flying missions, John F. Kennedy's brother?
I couldn't tell you.
That's interesting. I just thought of that because he died that way too.
That's right. Yes, he did.
What was it like interviewing the men that flew or were under Stewart's command? And what did you learn the most from them, other than just anecdotal type of things?
I learned how inadequate I am. because these guys, they're so cool. They're gone now. The one is still alive, but the two that helped me the most, they were both co-pilots under Stewart. They had both been P-51 pilots, or P-40 pilots, I'm sorry, Warhawk pilots, who were told, oh, we're going to send you to a base in Florida and you're going to get advanced fighter training. They got sent to Florida and they were made B-24 co-pilots. And they were so pissed because of that. In fact, one of them named his B-24 Pissed Off. That was because they were pissed off. And Jim had to call him in and say, look, do you really want to name your plane that? It's going to be on the newsreels that you're pissed off, and you're in my squadron. And so he had to talk them out of naming their plane Pissed Off. But so these two guys that helped me the most were still had a grudge. 70 years later, they still had a grudge because they had been dragged out of fighters to fly co-pilot in a B-24.
How old were they? They must have been like 22, 23 when.
Yeah. Everybody, all those pilots were 21 to 25.
Yeah.
And Jim, of course, was 35, 36. He was older than the base commander, but that was how intent he was. Plus, there was never a question that Jim was going to be a fighter pilot, because his reactions were too slow, because he was already 35 years old and he was 6'3", and he would never fit in a cockpit. So he even had trouble fitting into, especially a B-17 cockpit, because those are really cramped, but he had more room in the B-24 cockpit. So he was always the old man. He was always older than everybody else, which is good in a sense, because they had a great amount of security in being in Jim's squadron, in Jim's group, because he was so good, such a good communicator, and so stable and so mature.
Must have done a number on their young heads that a literal movie matinee idol is how quickly did that rub off? Or just wash away? Okay, I'm not going to be asking him about Mr. Smith Goes to Washington or the Philadelphia story.
Well, they said that when he drank, he would talk about his conquests, because
really?
Yeah, the first part of the book, it's really about Jim and his conquests, because he was quite the ladies' man from 1935 to 1941. I mean, he dated all the A-listers. He dated, his first steady girlfriend was Ginger Rogers, and then he moved on from her to, he was Norma Shearer's boy toy for a while, and they based the character of Joe Gillis in Sunset Boulevard on Jim Stewart and Norma Shearer. And the whole, I don't know if you've ever seen Sunset Boulevard, but she gives him a cigarette case. It's a gold cigarette case, says Crazy About the Boy. Norma Shearer had given Jim Stewart a gold cigarette case, and it was called Crazy About the Boy.
Wow.
He dated Marlene Dietrich, got her pregnant. That didn't end well. So Lana Turner, Jean Harlow, he went through them all. And
I went to the same high school that Jean Harlow went to.
Oh, really?
To Lake Forest Academy. It was Ferry Hall, but they merged with my school. And so when I was, every day I would see a picture of Jean Harlow and Bix Beiderbecke, because they were like bad kids that were sent to school there and then they left.
Harleen Carpenter. So was that in the Midwest somewhere?
Yeah, right outside Chicago.
Oh, there you go.
But the gosh, it's amazing when I lived in LA for a little while, for about 5 years. It's where my daughter was born there. And my buddy and I would always say, we would drive past the studios and we wish we were like William Holden, that even though we weren't working, we could go hang out and take a nap on a studio head's couch. I always thought that was really cool. But so what, aside from the age and the wisdom, was he universally respected as a soldier and a pilot?
Yeah, from the top down, from the generals down. Yeah. And so he had the cachet of being Jimmy Stewart, the Hollywood matinee idol, as you say.
He was way bigger than that. That just came out of my mouth.
Yeah, but no, I mean, like he was a hard to qualify star. I mean, like he wasn't typical leading man, he wasn't Clark Gable, but he had just won an Academy Award, so he was like super well known, and he could, like, I wrote a book more recently about Audrey Hepburn and her UNICEF years, and it's the same thing where dictators, everyone in the world wanted to meet with Audrey Hepburn, get their picture taken with Audrey Hepburn. The generals were the same way with Jimmy Stewart. They wanted to hang out with him. They wanted to hear about Lana Turner, what she really like. And so he had that ability. He could affect what orders were given to him because he was Jimmy Stewart. He played the Stewart card. He never played it to get out of tough situations. He played it to get into tough situations.
That's
so
what's unique.
Huh?
That's what's unique.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It really is. So he had respect from the top down. He had respect from the bottom up, because you had to separate, writing a book about his combat career, separate a lot of mythology, because after the war, guys who had served with him at Tivenham or at Old Buckenham would tell stories about, well, he had this slow drawl and he was kind of, a hayseed and whatever, but he was a great guy. No. Major Stewart, Lieutenant Colonel Stewart was a tough disciplinarian, and he earned respect for that. He earned respect. He would chew you out if you did anything wrong in the air. He would chew you out if you did anything wrong on the ground. He earned respect that way. And so, yeah, there was a lot of mythology about odd gee shucks, Jimmy Stewart in the no.
How did he play that off later on in life? Because obviously myths get larger and more robust, and yet he remained describe how I would say enigmatic he was in terms of talking about World War II and his own experiences, or was he more transparent with anyone who would ask him about it? You'd said it was in the contract not to ask him, but were there any other kinds of instances?
No, he wouldn't talk about it. In fact, he kept his distance from his former, his fellow soldiers. He kept his distance from them. He was always, come to my wedding, come to my son's wedding, because people served with him and they wanted him around. And that was not Jim. Jim was very private. Now, there is a difference between Jim Stewart, who I have great respect for, and Jimmy Stewart, this caricature of himself that he fostered because that's how he made his money, So when you like on the Tonight Show, when he would go on and read those poems and stuff, that was Jimmy Stewart. That was the character he created, that slow speech and whatever. He had made that an art form. But that's not the person that's in the book. The book is about Jim Stewart, who grew up about 40 miles from me in southwestern Pennsylvania. He grew up in a small college town in southwestern Pennsylvania, and I grew up in another one. So I mean, like, I really understood the vibe of what he had grown up as. And so there's a big disparity between Jimmy Stewart and the real guy, Jim Stewart, who was kind of cranky and remote and distant and did continue to suffer PTSD for decades. His daughter told me about how his dad, she would find her dad just sitting alone in the dark, and she just would never understand until she read the book. And she said, thank you. I mean, thank you, because she's got a twin sister, so there is, and they have a brother. There are 3 of them that are still alive, and they really had no idea what their father had gone through. But now they understand him a lot better. He was tricked into making one training film called Winning Your Wings. which he was a trooper. He went through with it after there is a big documented blow up where this Warner Brothers crew comes to Moffett Field and he doesn't know they're coming. And I mean, like, it's a pretty funny episode in the book. But after that, he refused to do anything related to Hollywood. I think it's very telling. His best friend was Henry Fonda, and they had gone, they had become actors together. They had starred in New York City together. They came out in close proximity to Hollywood. And I asked Fonda's biographer, Scott Iman, who I know pretty well, did you ever stumble on any letters that Stewart wrote to Fonda? No. Fonda served in the Pacific. Stewart was in England, and there are no letters. I mean, Fonda spent his time, or Stewart spent his time doing his job, and he left Hollywood completely behind. He was 100% focused on the 8th Air Force while he was in the service. He didn't contact an agent. He had no idea. He came back and got an agent because he did he didn't have one. He didn't have a contract. He didn't have an agent. He didn't have a house to come back to Hollywood to because he left it all behind completely and had to start from scratch.
Had he flown in the years after World War II?
Well, it's very interesting that he vowed never to fly again after his last mission was sort of a disaster. His last mission was against an Me-262 base, a jet fighter base in Germany. And his formation almost like two parts of his formation almost collided. He cracked up again. His commanding officer said, "You better not fly anymore." And he said, "Yeah, you're right." And he vowed never to fly again. He vowed never. Now that lasted. So he came back to the United States on a ship and it lasted for a while, but then he got the bug again. And then he bought a P-51 and he was on his team, this team that set land speed records, 560 mile an hour in a P-51 or something. So, I mean, he got the bug again. And then he flew until he was really old and really shouldn't have been flying. He couldn't even tell you where he was going anymore. He was so old while he was flying. But so, yeah.
Is it a rumor that he went on some kind of operation as a visitor in Vietnam after his stepson was killed in action? Is that true or?
Yeah, it's true. He did. There was one last mission. I think it might have been before his stepson was killed.
Wow.
I'm not sure about that, but yeah, there was one in a B-52 and he got to sit at the controls and go on this last mission. That was it. And then he was out of the Air Force Reserve soon after that.
But I mean, that must have been just it's devastating that he experienced that, because I'm sure he was close with his stepson or felt a certain, I mean, that was just I have a lot of admiration for people who had made the decision to not go, answer their country's call, but I also respect people who, as a matter of conscience, couldn't do it. There's a lot of, making a choice in any situation is very difficult. And because it takes courage not to do something, and the greatest courage is to actually make a decision and go through with it. And that's what I miss, or that's maybe I see it in with rose-colored glasses, or I mythologize it too. But there is something about these young men from the World War II that they just went into something that we really can't imagine unless we've been in combat. But that was combat. Oh my God!
And they're so young, and it was such a clear and present danger. It was us or them, and there was no middle ground. It's a lot more political these days. When we go off and fight, is it a righteous cause like World War II? No, probably not. Sometimes, but it's not very often that clear cut. But we needed them, and they answered the bell. And boy, they changed history.
Yeah, it's definitely, I forgot the French, I don't know if it was a poet, but the color of truth is always gray. There's a lot of gray areas in World War II. And I just got done reading a book by Anthony Beaver about the Soviet war against Germany. We went through some serious stuff, but my goodness, what the Soviets went through, and that whole eastern part of Europe that was just devouring it, or just it's just horrible. But I'm really glad you came on, because I've had this fascination with James Stewart, and I really want people to buy your book, and I'm gonna buy it right after we talk. Is there an Audible version?
Yes, there is. There is, yes, and it's by I forgot the narrator, of course, but it's a really good read. So yeah, so you can do Kindle, you can do hardcover, you could do trade paperback, or you can do the audiobook.
Now, I honestly think you should write a screenplay and have it animated, because you could get someone to do the voice. And now with technology, you could make an amazing film. I mean, there haven't been many movies made about flyers. I just know of like maybe 10, in World War II in the last 25, 30 years, not counting like the 12 O'Clock Eyes and things like that. But do you have a favorite war movie in terms of the air war?
Oh, the air war. I got two, 12 O'Clock High with Peck, and Memphis Belle. I really love Memphis Belle, because even though they condensed like 25 missions worth of heroics into 1 2-hour period,
Yes,
they nailed the youth of a crew. You always see, especially during the war, like Alan Hale or these old guys up in the air that had no business up there. But in 12 O'Clock High, they're young, like they should be, not as young as they should be. But in Memphis Belle, they really were. They nailed that aspect of it with Matthew Modine and those guys. I mean, like, okay, he is the prototypical pilot of that era that people looked up to. They did not mess around, boy, because they knew they had 9 other guys' lives in their hands in addition to their own. And that plane was worth a lot of money. So they would put the best guy from the best school in the pilot seat. And that's what Matthew Modine represented. And you make me want to go watch it now.
I'm good. I'm friends with Neil Giantoli, who played the gunner in that movie. He's got like, it's just the way his eyes light up, inside those goggles. It blew me away. And you reminded me of 12 O'Clock High when you were describing going to the airfield in that. But no, I think you should make a film. You have it in you. You know all of the principal players. You could even talk about Hollywood, and not a documentary, but I would love to be in the cockpit next to.
Well, there is a screenplay of Mission floating around out there right now.
Good.
That I participated in, and so we'll just see.
Well, I'm rooting for you, and especially since you gave me time this afternoon, and I hope that you and your family have a Merry Christmas, and your wife is no longer mad at you for making her trudge through the mud and go see bombing sites.
Yeah, no, we're good. We're good.
Right,
thank you, Stephen. Thank you for inviting me.
Oh my goodness, this was great. I'll send you an email as soon as I'm done reading. I'm going to start tonight. I can't wait.
All right, good.
All right, buddy.
That, because
take care of yourself.
I'm holding you to that.
You'll get an email by Saturday.
Excellent.
All right. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.